When the sun dipped below the horizon in medieval England, the world didn't just go dark, it disappeared. For a peasant or a townsman living without electricity, nightfall meant plunging into a thick, almost palpable darkness, full of fears, superstitions, and real dangers. In this world, light was not just a convenience, it was synonymous with life, security, and civilization itself. We used to think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, and in a domestic sense, this was true. Most people lived in the rhythm of the sun, rising at dawn, going to bed at dusk. But what if you had to deliver a cow in the middle of the night, fix a broken tool by morning, or just pass the long, dank winter evening when darkness lasts for 16 hours at a time? How did these people, without kerosene lamps or paraffin candles, wrest precious hours from the night? What ingenious in their simplicity and sometimes unexpected solutions did they use to light a flame in their humble dwelling? Today we're going to look deep into that darkness and reveal 10 forgotten medieval English lighting techniques. Are you ready to learn how an ordinary marsh reed was transformed into a source of light for an entire evening? Why smoldering embers were as important as a bright flame? And which mushroom could serve as a nightlight for a lost traveler? Stay with us and you will realize that the fight against darkness was a real art, requiring knowledge, patience, and incredible ingenuity. For the vast majority of English peasants in the early and high Middle Ages, the question of lighting was a simple and uncontroversial one. They had no choice between candles, lamps, or torches. There was only one source of light and warmth: the central open hearth. It was not just a part of the interior, it was the sun around which the whole planet called family revolved. As the sun set, all life in the hut shrank to a small, lighted circle around the fire. Outside this circle, there was almost absolute darkness, where only vague silhouettes were visible. All the evening's work, all the socializing, all the eating, all took place here, in the spot lit by the dancing flames. Women spun or mended clothes, bringing the work as close to the fire as possible. Men sharpened tools or wove baskets, and children listened to stories while watching sparks fly into the smoke hole in the roof. The light from the hearth was lively but capricious. It was uneven, and it blinked at any draft, casting strange, frightening shadows on the walls. It was dim, and to see anything small, you had to stoop very low, risking burns or smoke inhalation. The quality of the light depended directly on the quality of the wood. Dry logs of hard wood gave a bright, clean flame, while damp or rotten ones smoked and smoked, filling the already cramped room with acrid smoke. This smoke was not just an inconvenience, it was a slow killer. Constant inhalation of soot led to chronic lung disease. Coughing and acrid smoke caused inflammation and eye disease, which were the scourge of the era. The walls and thatched roof were covered from the inside with a thick layer of sticky, black soot. But despite the smoke and danger, fire had tremendous psychological power. It was not just a physical barrier, but a magical barrier against a hostile world. Beyond its shivering light stretched a darkness full of real predators and imaginary evil spirits. The circle of light from the hearth was a circle of safety, a sacred space where the family was protected. It was not uncommon to throw a pinch of salt or a drop of ale into the fire as a bloodless sacrifice to the guardian spirits of the house to enlist their support for the long, dark night. This total dependence on one light source dictated the entire rhythm of life. There was no possibility of doing things in different corners of the house. Everyone was confined to the hearth. This created incredible crowding, but also incredible cohesion. The hearth was not just a heater, it was a social center, a place where the family felt united, protected from the darkness and cold of the outside world. At the same time, every member of the family knew from childhood that fire was not only a friend, but also a deadly threat. A single spark on dry straw could destroy the house and all the meager possessions in minutes. The ability to control a flame was a basic survival skill. But what if you needed to move away from the hearth or move the light to another part of the house? For this, there was another, even more common and ingenious in its simplicity: lamp. If the wax candle was a symbol of wealth and church, Its humble but ubiquitous counterpart in the homes of ordinary Englishmen was the rushlight, a lamp made from the core of a common marsh reed. It was an ingenious technology that made it possible to produce a light source from just about anything that grew underfoot, and required almost no input other than time and animal fat. The manufacturing process was painstaking. In the fall, peasants collected long, mature stalks of reeds. Then they had to be carefully peeled from the tough green skin, leaving only a thin strip for strength. This strip was critical. It served as a kind of spine for the fragile core, preventing it from breaking during soaking and burning. It was a job requiring a steady hand and great patience, which girls were taught from an early age. A spongy white core remained inside. These blanks were carefully dried. The next step was to melt the fat, usually the cheapest, lamb or beef fat, which was left over from the slaughter. The dried reed core was slowly dipped into hot melted fat, allowed to soak, taken out and allowed to solidify. This procedure was repeated several times until the reed stick was covered with an even layer of fat. The result was a thin, flexible, and very fragile candle. It gave a dim, smoking light and burned out rather quickly, on average in 15 to 30 minutes. Rushlight making was often a collective activity on long fall evenings. The whole family, from small to large, sat around the hearth. The children, who gathered reeds from the marsh during the day, helped to clean them, and the women, the main guardians of the craft, did the most responsible part, soaking them in hot, foul-smelling fat. This was not just labor, but an important ritual in preparation for the long winter, a time when knowledge and skills were passed from mother to daughter. To hold the rushlight, they used special metal stands, rush nips, similar to tongs or clothespins on a leg. They allowed the reed lamp to be fixed at an angle, which was thought to slow its burning. A family could make hundreds of such rushlights for the winter by bundling them and hanging them in a dry place. Despite all their disadvantages, dim light, smoke, unpleasant odor of burning fat, short life, rushlights were a real salvation for the poor. The smell of this light was unforgettable. The pungent, greasy spirit of mutton fat mixed with smoke. The flame constantly crackled and spit drops of hot lard, requiring a ratchnip to be placed under it with water or sand. And there was so little light. To light a room for just 2 or 3 hours after sunset, a family would need to burn half a dozen or more of these candles. It was a true economy of light, where every minute of burning counted. They allowed to do small chores, light the way to the stable, or simply create an illusion of light in a dark hut. It was survival technology, the peak of ingenuity born of necessity. But even the most frugal rushlight would burn out. So how to keep the fire burning until morning without burning precious fuel? There was another trick for that. The main task of the medieval householder was not so much to light a fire as to keep it burning. Fuel was precious, and the process of kindling with flint and crucifix was labor-intensive. Therefore, the practice of preserving the fire overnight, known as curfew, from the Old French couvre-feu, to cover the fire, was widespread. This term is not accidental. In many English towns and villages, a special curfew bell rang in the evening. It was not just a bedtime bell, but an official fire safety measure in a world of wooden houses and thatched roofs. At this signal, every householder was obliged to dim his hearth to prevent night fires. Thus, the personal stratagem of fuel conservation was woven into the public safety system. But this practice also had an unexpected side effect, a weak but constant source of nightlight. Before going to bed, when the main wood in the hearth had burned out, the master did not put out the fire completely. He gathered the largest, hottest coals in the center of the hearth and carefully covered them with a thick layer of ash. It was an art. You had to choose the right coals from hardwoods like oak that smoldered long and hot. The layer of ash had to be not too thick, so as not to smother the heat, but not too thin, so that the coals would not burn until morning. The ash cut off the oxygen, and the coals stopped burning brightly and went into a slow, economical smoldering mode. In this state, they could keep the heat and glow for 8 to 10 hours until morning. It was the faint, deep ruby glow of the smoldering embers under the ashes that was the main nightlight in the medieval house. It did not provide enough light to read or work, but it was enough to dispel the absolute, disorienting darkness. In its ghostly light, you could make out the contours of the furniture, find the door, walk to the cradle with the baby without bumping into anything. This light was also a psychological defense. It gave the feeling that the heart of the house was not dead, but simply asleep. The quiet, lively glow in the middle of the night silence calmed, drove away fears and nocturnal creatures, both real and imaginary. When a man woke up in the middle of the night, he would see that familiar red light and realize that he was home, safe. In the morning, it was enough to rake the ashes, put some dry firewood, moss or shavings on the smoldering embers, and carefully fan them to make the fire flare up again. The morning revival of the fire was almost a sacred ritual. The mistress of the house, still in the pre-dawn twilight, came to the hearth, carefully raked the warm ashes, and when she saw live, pulsating embers, she exhaled with relief. A light whiff, and the first tongue of flame licked the dry moss, marking the victory over the darkness of the night and the beginning of a new day. This saved an enormous amount of time and effort. Smoldering embers were thus an ingenious dual-purpose solution. They kept the fire burning until morning and served as a permanent, safe, and completely free nightlight. But a brighter light required liquid fuel, and here the English used what their farm in the sea gave them. Although we often talk about candles in general, in medieval England there was a huge gulf between the expensive, fragrant wax candle and its ubiquitous but much less pleasant relative, the tallow candle. It was the tallow candle that was the main source of light for millions of peasants, artisans, and townspeople, and its use was associated with a number of inconveniences. The fuel for such candles was tallow, a clarified animal fat, most often mutton or beef fat. The manufacturing process was dirty and labor-intensive. The fat was melted in cauldrons, producing a foul-smelling mass, which was then repeatedly dipped into the wick. The wick, made of twisted hemp or linen, gradually grew layers of solidified fat, turning it into a candle. This process required patience and skill to make the layers even. The tallow candle burned unevenly, constantly smoldering and dripping hot grease. Its flame was dull, yellowish, and smoked heavily, filling the room with the acrid, unpleasant odor of burning fat. This odor was so distinctive that it could be considered the smell of poverty of the Middle Ages. The walls and ceiling in the rooms where the tallow candles were constantly burning were covered with a layer of greasy soot. In addition, the wick in a tallow candle burned out faster than the tallow itself, and it had to be constantly trimmed with special tongs. If this was not done, the flame became even bigger, began to smoke heavily, and could go out. That's why there were always tongs for removing the soot near the tallow candle. Despite all these disadvantages, tallow candles were the main artificial light source for the majority of the population. They were cheap, and the raw material for them was available in any farm where livestock was kept. They made it possible to extend the daylight hours, to do household chores after sunset, and not to sit in total darkness. It was a harsh but necessary reality. But was there any way to improve this dim, smoky light without resorting to expensive wax? It turns out yes, with architectural ingenuity. In the dark, almost windowless architecture of the early Middle Ages, any strip of light that penetrated from the outside was worth its weight in gold. English builders, perhaps intuitively or perhaps on the basis of ancient knowledge, sometimes used an ingenious technique that can be called the Moonbeam window. It was not a window in our sense, but rather a strategically placed opening designed to catch the light. Unlike regular windows, which served for a view, these openings, sometimes called luce or wind-eye, eye for the wind, which is the root of the word window, were often placed high on the wall, under the roof itself, especially on the south or west side of the house. They were made narrow and deep, with slopes extending inward. This shape was ingenious. The narrow outer opening minimized the penetration of rain and cold wind, while the wide inner slopes worked like a funnel, catching light from a large patch of sky and scattering it around the room. Thus, even a small opening could give a surprising amount of soft, diffused light without creating strong drafts. During the day when the sun was high, direct light did not enter such a window, but it captured the diffused light of the sky, creating a soft, even illumination in the room without harsh shadows. But its real magic manifested itself at night. The narrow opening was perfectly positioned to catch the light of the full moon. On a clear night, a column of moonlight streaming through the window would fall to the floor, creating an almost mystical, silvery spot in the pitch blackness of the hut. Moreover, this spot of light served as a primitive but reliable clock and calendar for the family. During the day, moving on the earthen floor, it marked the passage of time, indicating noon and the time for evening work. And from month to month, as the altitude of the sun above the horizon changed, so did the angle of incidence of the ray. An experienced owner could determine the approach of sowing or harvest by the position of the solar bunny on the wall. This was the connection of the house not only with light, but also with the cosmic rhythm of the seasons. This light was not enough to work, but it was enough to navigate the space, to see silhouettes of sleeping people, to feed an infant. Moonlight, unlike fire, was cool, safe, and completely free. It didn't require fuel, didn't smoke, and posed no fire hazard. Folklore and legends often mention beams of light falling into dark rooms and pointing to treasures or holy places. Perhaps behind these stories is the actual practice of using such architectural light traps. For a medieval man whose life was full of superstition, such a ray of moonlight could seem a real miracle, a divine sign. In the cramped, down-to-earth hut, smelling of smoke and earth, this pure, unearthly column of light falling from the sky was seen as the direct gaze of God or a patron saint, as a blessing that sanctified their humble existence. This trick demonstrates that lighting was as much a matter of technology as it was of architecture. A properly placed hole in the wall could do more good than a few smoking Rushlights, but it was also possible to amplify the light from an ordinary fire by using simple but effective reflective surfaces. With every light source dim and precious, medieval Englishmen intuitively used the laws of physics to amplify it. The simplest reflective surfaces placed near a fire could double, if not triple, the illumination in a room. It was an ingenious trick that required almost no expense. The simplest reflector was the wall behind the hearth. They tried to whitewash it with lime or chalk. The white light surface reflected much more light from the flame than dark, smoky walls, making the room lighter and visually more spacious. But this practice had a second, no less important function. Lime whitewash had weak antiseptic properties, preventing the growth of mold on damp walls and making the air in the hut a little healthier. Thus, one simple act, whitewashing, solved two problems at once. It multiplied precious light and fought the ubiquitous dampness. This practice was common everywhere, from peasant huts to castle halls. Special reflectors were used to amplify the light from a candle or oil lamp. In wealthy homes, these could be sheets of polished metal, pewter, bronze, or even silver. Such a shiny sheet installed behind the candle worked as a mirror, directing the light in the right direction and making it brighter. In wealthier homes or monasteries, these reflectors turned into real art. These were not just flat sheets, but special wall candlesticks known as sconces, where the polished metal plate behind the candle often had a concave shape. This design not only reflected, but focused the light, creating a directional beam that was convenient for reading or needlework. But simple peasants had little metal, so they used whatever was at hand. For example, an ordinary clay bowl whitened from the inside, or even a large white sea clam placed behind a Rushlight, already gave a noticeable effect. Sometimes a piece of polished, light-colored stone or bone was used. Any light, smooth surface could serve as a reflector. But there was another living reflector, the people themselves. Gathering in a tight circle around the hearth, dressed in their light linen shirts, their bodies and faces caught and reflected the light of the flame onto each other, creating a more illuminated and intimate space. The circle of people itself became part of the lighting system. Another trick was the use of water. A bowl of clean water placed in front of the candle worked like a lens, diffusing and slightly amplifying the light, making it softer and smoother. This helped to reduce harsh shadows and create a cozier atmosphere. These simple techniques demonstrate the incredible observation and ingenuity of medieval people. They had no scientific knowledge of optics, but they understood its basic laws in practice. The ability to multiply light was as important a skill as the ability to obtain it. But sometimes light was needed not in the house but outside, and this required other, more dangerous devices. When it was necessary to travel outside the house at night, to walk from the hut to the stable, to meet a late guest, or to take part in a night procession, the dim light of a rushlight or lamp was not enough. The street required a powerful, bright, and windproof source of light, and that source was most often a torch. But the medieval torch had little in common with the elegant mishals of the movies. The most common type of torch in wooded areas of England was that made from pine. They found so-called fat wood, a part of the trunk or root of an old pine tree that was heavily soaked in resin. This resinous wood burned very brightly, hot and long, almost unafraid of wind and rain. A long beam of such wood could be used as a ready-made torch. Another method was to make a torch from a stick, on one end of which was wrapped a piece of hemp or a piece of coarse cloth soaked in a combustible substance. Most often it was the same pine tar, or tar, which was collected from trees and melted. Such impregnation ensured a long and bright burning. However, torches had many disadvantages. They were extremely smoky. It was almost impossible to use them indoors. The room was instantly filled with acrid, choking smoke. The torch was strictly a street lamp. In addition, it was a huge fire hazard. Burning tar was constantly dripping from it and sparks were flying in all directions. A man with a torch in his hands posed a threat to wooden buildings and thatched roofs. Therefore, night torchlight parades, although they looked spectacular, often ended in fires. Despite the danger, torches were indispensable for night work, for lighting the way for guards on the castle walls, for military signals. The bright living light of the torch dispelled not only darkness, but also fear, creating a sense of power and control over the night elements. But not only people created light, sometimes the source of light was their very work. In a medieval village or town, there were places that were illuminated by light even on the darkest night. These were the workshops of craftsmen whose work was inextricably linked with fire. First of all, blacksmiths and potters' workshops. The fire in their pots and ovens was not only a necessity, but also a powerful source of illumination. The forge was a beacon in the village at night. The red-hot metal in the furnace, the sparks flying from under the blacksmith's hammer, and the flames on the walls and tools all created a bright, almost theatrical illumination. The blacksmith often worked late into the night to fulfill urgent orders, and the light of his forge was visible from afar, serving as a landmark for late travelers. For the blacksmith himself, this light was a byproduct of his work. It allowed him to see what he was doing without the use of additional lights. Moreover, by the color of the glowing metal, the skilled craftsman could determine its temperature, which was key to quality forging. Fire was his working tool and his lamp at the same time. A similar picture was observed in the pottery workshops during the firing of pottery. A large wood-fired kiln, heated to red hot, emitted not only intense heat, but also a bright light that illuminated the entire workshop and the surrounding area. Firing nights were a special event that required constant attention and supervision, and took place by the light of the kiln itself. Light from craft furnaces at coal miners, glass blowers, bakers, also played a role in the illumination of medieval settlements. These industrial light sources, although localized, contributed to the overall fight against the darkness of night. They were symbols of labor, of creation, and of the indomitable energy of fire that man had learned to put at his service. But sometimes in the thickest part of the forest, one could find a light that was not man-made. Deep in the dark, damp medieval forest, far from human habitation, there was another most mysterious source of light. It wasn't a candle or a fire, it was foxfire, or magic glow, a cold, ghostly, greenish-blue glow that came from rotting wood. This phenomenon, which we call bioluminescence today, was caused by a special kind of fungi, e.g. honeydew fungus, that grew on dead trees. The mycelium of this fungus, penetrating the wood, emitted a faint but visible glow in total darkness during its vital activity. For a medieval person unfamiliar with biology, this was a real miracle or a manifestation of magic. A traveler or hunter lost in the forest could come across such a glowing stump or log and use it as a natural nightlight. This light gave no heat and was too weak to work by. but it dispersed absolute darkness, allowed to see the outlines of objects, and gave great psychological relief. It was considered good luck to find such a foxfire in the forest. There were, of course, many superstitions and legends surrounding this phenomenon. It was believed to be the light of fairies, elves, or the souls of the undead. Some believed it pointed to hidden treasures or, conversely, trapped travelers. It was a light from another otherworldly world, frightening and alluring at the same time. Nevertheless, its practical use was undoubted. A piece of glowing rotten wood could be taken into the hut and used as a weak but absolutely safe, not requiring fire, nightlight to soothe a crying child, for example. This ingenious cunning consisted in pure observation and the ability to utilize even the most unusual gifts of nature. But let's return to more prosaic things. The most mass-popular lamp was still a candle, but made of the most accessible material. An open flame of a candle or a rushlight was useless for traveling in the street at night or for working in a stable where there was a strong draft. It was immediately blown out. A lantern was needed to protect the fire from the wind. In medieval England, the most widespread and ingenious solution was a lantern whose glass was made of processed animal horn. Glass was incredibly expensive and fragile, available only for churches and castles. Cow and bull horns, on the other hand, were a cheap and available byproduct of cattle ranching. The process of processing them was labor-intensive, but well known to artisans. It was an art that required not only strength but also jewel-like precision. The horn was boiled for a long time to make it soft. Then it was split into thin plates. These plates were scraped until the wall was as thin as parchment. The slightest wrong move and the plate cracked. The whole work was a waste. Horners were valued in the towns and passed on the secrets of their craft from generation to generation. These thin, flexible horn plates were inserted into the wooden or metal frame of the lantern. The construction of the lantern itself was also elaborate. The frame was most often made of wood, but for greater reliability and durability, wrought iron or tin was used. There was a ventilation hole with a conical lid on the top, so that the smoke and heat from the candle would go out, but the rain would not get inside. Inside such a lantern usually burned not a rushlight, but a short, thick tallow candle, which was more stable and gave a more even flame. The horn plates were not afraid of heat, were durable, and, unlike glass, did not break when dropped. Of course, the light coming through the horn was dim, murky, yellowish-brown in color. It distorted the colors and gave only a general idea of the surrounding space. The light that such a lantern gave was peculiar. It did not dispel the darkness, but rather made it thicker beyond its faint glow. The yellowish, murky beam picked out only a small section of the road, making the shadows dance and stretch, turning familiar bushes and trees into bizarre monsters. This small, flickering light, encased in a horn dungeon, created a tiny, fragile bubble of safety around its owner, in the midst of the vast, hostile ocean of night. But the lantern with horn plates perfectly fulfilled its main function. It reliably protected the flame from wind and rain. With such a lantern, one could go out in any weather. It was used by night guards patrolling the streets, by peasants going to the stable to check on their cattle, and by travelers reaching an inn. Having such a lantern was a sign of a certain wealth and prudence. It was an important tool in the household, providing mobility and safety at night. This simple technology, using a byproduct of animal husbandry to create a sheltered lantern, is another striking example of medieval ingenuity. Medieval lighting is more than just fire in the dark. It is a story of survival, wisdom, and human ingenuity that allowed people to create comfort and safety in the harshest of times. Each lamp, each candle is a small victory over darkness and cold, a symbol of hope and warmth in the heart of the home. Immersing ourselves in these ancient techniques, we not only learn how our ancestors lived, but also draw lessons that are still relevant today. If you are interested in traveling through time and discovering the forgotten secrets of the Middle Ages, if you appreciate real stories about life, struggle, and survival, subscribe to our channel. New discoveries and exciting stories from the past that help you understand the present are waiting for you here. Don't miss out. There are many more amazing things to come.